The moment a transmission reached Earth from the Galactic Council, the world's leaders gathered in stunned silence, the message crystal clear yet incomprehensible in its audacity. Humanity was being declared an enemy of the galaxy and subject to immediate annihilation, and while the Council's statement was formal and polite, every word dripped with condescension, reflecting centuries of underestimation of the species that had barely ventured beyond their solar system. And as Earth's defense, ministers analyzed the Council's fleet movements. It became apparent that hundreds of vessels, larger than anything previously recorded, were converging on the system at speeds that defied conventional propulsion theory. And despite the overwhelming odds, a strange determination filled the room, led by General Marcus Hale, a veteran of multiple space defense simulations, who reminded his staff that humanity's unpredictability had always been its greatest weapon. And while alien analysts had calculated humanity's responses as linear and limited, they had never accounted for the improvisational genius of human strategy under extreme duress. And as Earth's fleets mobilized, civilians watched the skies with both fear and awe, knowing that this conflict would not be fought on the conventional terms the galaxy had grown accustomed to. And while the Council's emissaries prepared their strike, underestimating the speed at which humans could adapt, scientists on Mars were activating experimental reactors capable of producing energy pulses that could disable entire capital ships without firing a single projectile. And across Earth, engineers worked day and night to retrofit commercial spacecraft into combat vessels armed with electromagnetic disruptors, while programmers created algorithms that could override alien targeting systems and feed false positional data, creating phantom fleets in the void. And as the first Council scouts arrived at the outer rim of the solar system, expecting easy destruction, they were met with an electromagnetic storm that appeared naturally, but was in fact entirely human-engineered, causing several vessels to veer off course and collide. And in the Council chambers, the alien representatives exchanged shocked glances, unable to understand how a planet with no known interstellar combat history could produce such precise and devastating interference. And on Earth, General Hale coordinated with Admiral Leona Ruiz, whose decades of tactical simulation experience enabled her to deploy human fleets in formations that confounded alien sensors, utilizing planets' natural gravity wells and asteroid belts as traps. And as communications went dark for some Council ships, the humans launched their first counteroffensive, not by direct attack, but through sabotage of the enemy's automated navigation arrays, sending entire battle groups spinning harmlessly into space with no chance of regrouping. And simultaneously, scientists unveiled the first of the orbital railguns capable of firing kinetic slugs at near light speed, obliterating smaller Council craft before they could reach Earth's atmosphere. And even the media began broadcasting humanity's resilience, showing engineers and pilots working in near-impossible conditions with courage and ingenuity that was impossible for the Council to model or predict. And as the days passed, intelligence teams discovered that several Council races were already reconsidering their position, realizing that humanity's defensive measures were only the beginning, as humans had begun covert operations to seize Council supply lines and communication hubs, striking with surgical precision and leaving no trace of human casualties while crippling the enemy's logistics. And yet, amidst the escalating chaos, there were moments of quiet heroism, such as Captain Elena Ortiz personally piloting a commandeered alien vessel through a debris field to deliver vital components to a crippled human fleet, showcasing both bravery and a level of improvisation that no alien combat doctrine could anticipate. And as the initial wave of attacks concluded, the Galactic Council realized with growing horror that their intelligence had been catastrophically wrong, and every attempt to assert dominance was met with increasingly sophisticated human countermeasures. And by the time the Second Fleet approached, Earth was not only prepared, but it created entire decoy fleets composed of unmanned drones that could mimic human tactics, confusing enemy commanders and forcing them into overcautious maneuvers. And while the Council attempted to coordinate a massive retaliatory strike, humans had already predicted their formations, using both brute force and subtle deception to turn the enemy's strengths against them. And as the first major battle commenced near the asteroid belt, Council commanders were stunned to watch their most advanced cruisers annihilated in seconds by a combination of human railgun barges, gravitational traps, and electronic warfare, leaving their soldiers and pilots scrambling to understand how a supposedly primitive civilization could wield technology and strategy with such lethal efficiency. And across the galaxy, observers who had doubted humanity's relevance began sending frantic messages to halt the Council's campaign. But the momentum was already in humans' favor, and on Earth, leaders knew that this was only the beginning, as humanity would continue to fight with every resource, intellect, and ounce of ingenuity at its disposal, proving that the species the galaxy had dismissed as insignificant was capable of not only defending itself, but rewriting the rules of interstellar conflict. And in that moment, the entire Council understood the unthinkable truth. Declaring war on Earth had been a catastrophic error, one that would forever change the balance of power in the galaxy. As the initial shockwave of human ingenuity rippled to the Council fleets, the commanders began scrambling to assess the true scope of Earth's capabilities, realizing that every tactic they had planned, every overwhelming numerical advantage, and every expectation of fear or surrender had been utterly inverted. And while alien politicians and strategists convened in panic to figure out how a primitive species could produce such coordinated, devastating defense, Earth's operation centers were calm and precise, led by General Marcus Hale and Admiral Leona Ruiz, who orchestrated a synchronized campaign across orbital, planetary, and deep space vectors, employing a combination of human adaptability and cutting-edge engineering that turned the Council's assumptions into liabilities. And as human fleets moved through the outer colonies of the solar system, they were shadowed by stealth drones capable of remaining invisible to alien sensors, collecting intelligence that allowed humans to anticipate reinforcements and intercept supply convoys before they reached Earth. And meanwhile, scientists on Titan and Ganymede completed the final calibration of the gravimetric pulse projectors, devices designed to manipulate space-time subtly yet lethally, creating areas of high gravitational distortion that would tear through enemy hulls while leaving human vessels untouched. And as the Council's elite strike force advanced toward the asteroid belt, believing they had finally identified the critical point to deliver a crushing blow, they suddenly found their communications jammed, their navigation arrays failing, and their coordinated attack collapsing as if some unseen hand had rewritten the battle in real time. And amid the confusion, human pilots executed daring maneuvers through narrow asteroid passages that alien ships could not follow, using the terrain to disable entire wings of advanced cruisers without direct confrontation. And in the Council chambers, the sense of disbelief grew into panic, as analysts realized that their intelligence reports had been disastrously flawed, failing to account for human capacity to learn, improvise, and innovate faster than any calculation could predict. And across Earth, emergency broadcast systems kept the public informed, not to incite fear, but to reinforce the narrative of human resilience, showing images of civilians assisting in the retrofitting of spacecraft, scientists fine-tuning gravimetric and electromagnetic weapons, and engineers racing to complete orbital railguns, all of which created an atmosphere of shared purpose that the Council could not model. And while alien strategists debated how to salvage their fleets, humans launched the first coordinated offensive against Council outposts, striking simultaneously from multiple vectors with unmanned drones, laser arrays, and gravimetric distortions that rendered entire installations useless. And even the most advanced Council ships found themselves unable to defend against a blend of brute force, tactical precision, and relentless human creativity. And as the battle unfolded, human command demonstrated an extraordinary ability to adapt mid-combat, anticipating alien countermeasures and altering strategies on the fly, turning what the Council thought would be simple engagements into nightmarish, unpredictable encounters that drained morale and resources. And in one remarkable maneuver, Captain Elena Ortiz led a squadron of hybrid ships through a previously uncharted asteroid field, using gravitational anomalies to mask their approach while simultaneously delivering crippling strikes against alien command vessels, demonstrating a level of tactical improvisation that no Council manual could predict. And while the aliens struggled to regroup, Earth scientists deployed the first of the temporal sensor arrays, devices capable of predicting enemy movements seconds before they occurred, allowing human fleets to preempt attacks with deadly efficiency. And as entire wings of alien cruisers were destroyed or forced into retreat, the Council was forced to acknowledge the terrifying reality. Humanity was no longer an underdeveloped, predictable species, but a force capable of dominating in a war that spanned the solar system. And as news of each victory reached Earth, global morale surged, civilians and military personnel alike taking pride in the ingenuity, courage, and discipline that had turned annihilation into overwhelming advantage. And while the Council attempted desperate negotiations, Earth had already secured strategic positions in orbit, neutralized supply chains, and demonstrated a readiness to expand operations to the farthest reaches of the system, leaving the alien leadership with only one undeniable truth. The war they declared was unraveling in ways they had never imagined, and every miscalculation, every underestimation, and every assumption about human weakness had been weaponized against them, proving that declaring war on Earth had been not just a mistake, but a fatal misjudgment, one that would echo through the galaxy for generations as humans prepare to take the fight beyond their home system, showcasing that their combination of courage, adaptability, and tactical brilliance could never be anticipated, predicted, or contained by even the most advanced alien civilization. And in that relentless campaign, the humans' relentless march from defensive survival to offensive dominance was now undeniable, leaving the Galactic Council scrambling in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the power they had provoked, and knowing deep within that the galaxy would never again treat humanity as insignificant. As the battles raged across the solar system, human forces refined their tactics with precision that left even the most seasoned alien commanders bewildered, realizing that Earth's defenders were not merely reacting, but anticipating. And while the Council attempted to deploy new fleet formations and exotic weaponry designed to overwhelm planetary defenses, humans had already developed countermeasures, turning alien technology against its owners and using captured vessels as decoys and traps. And on the surface, engineers completed the deployment of orbital defense platforms capable of firing concentrated plasma and railgun slugs, integrated with AI-guided targeting systems that analyzed enemy movement patterns in real time, allowing human ships to strike with lethal accuracy before the aliens could even detect the source. And meanwhile, scientists working in deep space labs unveiled a breakthrough in energy manipulation, creating localized quantum disruptions that rendered Council shields ineffective for brief but decisive windows, allowing human forces to punch through the alien lines at critical moments. And as fleets maneuvered near the asteroid belts, gravitational traps engineered by human physicists forced entire wings of cruisers into collisions or destabilized orbits, eliminating key components of the enemy's offensive without a single human casualty. And even the Council's diplomats, watching remotely, were forced to admit that their assessment of humanity's capabilities had been laughably inadequate. For the planet they had dismissed as primitive now exhibited technological sophistication and strategic ingenuity that rivaled the combined fleets of their most advanced species. And while humans continued to expand their operations, covert teams infiltrated Council supply depots, commandeering fuel reserves and communication hubs, leaving enemy ships isolated and unable to coordinate effectively. And in the midst of this chaos, General Marcus Hale orchestrated simultaneous strikes across multiple points of engagement, each action designed to exploit weaknesses predicted by human superior pattern recognition algorithms. And as alien vessels faltered, civilian participation became crucial, with volunteers assisting in the rapid construction of auxiliary weapons platforms and emergency repairs, demonstrating that the collective will of humanity, unified by a shared sense of purpose, was as powerful as any conventional military force. And Captain Elena Ortiz led daring raids through uncharted asteroid fields, exploiting natural gravitational anomalies, and using captured Council mapping data to deliver surgical strikes on command vessels, earning accolades not only for her bravery, but for her strategic insight, which often preempted alien maneuvers by minutes or even hours. And as the war escalated, humans demonstrated a terrifying ability to innovate on the fly, retrofitting cargo ships with gravitic cannons, converting mining rigs into long-range bombardment platforms, and deploying AI-managed drone swarms that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated Council defenses. And while the aliens struggled to understand how a species with such limited interstellar history could deploy such complex operations, humans were simultaneously establishing forward bases on Mars, Titan, and Europa, creating a network of fortified positions that provided both strategic depth and operational flexibility. And as more alien fleets arrived, expecting to crush humanity's scattered defenses, they were systematically drawn into traps that leveraged the planet's natural terrain, orbital anomalies, and human-engineered hazards, leading to catastrophic losses and forcing surviving alien commanders into chaotic retreats. And across the galaxy, news of humanity's victory spread, shocking neutral civilizations and forcing previously complacent species to reconsider their own assumptions about Earth's technological and strategic potential. And as the Council convened emergency meetings to reassess their approach, human leadership remained composed, continually adapting, continually innovating, and continually proving that every prediction the Council had made about their limitations was wrong. And by the time the third wave of Council reinforcements approached, they found themselves facing a human military that was not only fully prepared, but had already redefined the rules of engagement, blending conventional force, innovative technology, and human adaptability into an unstoppable combination that left alien commanders in disbelief, realizing too late that declaring war on Earth had not led to a swift conquest, but had instead unleashed a force capable of turning every weakness, assumption, and miscalculation into their own undoing. And as humans continued to press their advantage, it became clear that the planet they had dismissed as insignificant was now the epicenter of a revolution in interstellar conflict, demonstrating that human ingenuity, courage, and relentless determination could not be measured, predicted, or contained, and that the Council's declaration of war had become the single greatest strategic error in galactic history, setting the stage for a conflict in which humanity would not only survive but dominate, leaving no doubt that the galaxy had underestimated the species at its own peril. As the fourth phase of the war unfolded, the Galactic Council's confidence collapsed into raw fear, because every new fleet they committed vanished faster than the last, and the strategic models that had guided them for millennia no longer produced outcomes that match reality, forcing Council tacticians to confront the impossible truth that humanity did not fight wars as a static civilization, but as a constantly evolving organism. And while alien admirals attempted to impose rigid command structures, human forces thrived on decentralized decision-making, allowing captains, engineers, and even junior officers to exploit fleeting opportunities without waiting for authorization. And this flexibility became devastating when humans initiated deep strike operations beyond the solar system, sending long-range stealth vessels through previously ignored jump corridors that alien cartographers had dismissed as unstable, only to discover that human physics teams had found ways to stabilize these routes long enough for rapid insertion and extraction. And the first Council shipyard to fall was not destroyed by overwhelming firepower, but rendered inert when human cyber warfare specialists injected adaptive code into its automated defense network, causing turrets to identify each other as hostile targets. And by the time the Council realized what was happening, the entire facility had torn itself apart without a single human shot being fired. And on Earth, this victory was analyzed calmly and methodically, not celebrated recklessly, because General Marcus Hale understood that arrogance was the one mistake humanity could not afford to make. And under his direction, war colleges were established in real time, pulling data from every engagement and distributing tactical updates across the fleet within minutes, ensuring that no lesson was learned twice the hard way. And meanwhile, Admiral Leona Ruiz supervised the deployment of the mobile Bastion arrays, massive interconnected defense platforms capable of relocating across planetary orbits, ensuring that no human stronghold could ever be targeted with certainty. And when Council forces attempted a coordinated assault on Mars, believing it to be a symbolic blow that would shatter human morale, they instead flew into a layered kill zone that used overlapping gravitational distortions, railgun fire, and sensor spoofing to dismantle the invasion wave piece by piece, leaving wreckage drifting silently across Martian orbit as a warning. And among the human pilots engaged in that battle was Captain Elena Ortiz, who executed a maneuver later studied across the fleet, deliberately shutting down her ship's primary reactor to appear disabled, only to reignite it at point-blank range and deliver a gravitic pulse that crushed an enemy cruiser from within. And as Council survivors transmitted fragmented reports back to their superiors, their language shifted from confidence to confusion, then to disbelief as repeated. References to human unpredictability replaced previously clinical assessments, and the Council's internal divisions widened as several member species began questioning whether continuing the war was survivable at all. But those advocating withdrawal were overruled by hardliners who still believed numerical superiority could prevail, and it was this final miscalculation that sealed their fate, because humans had already begun phase transition warfare, not merely fighting fleets but dismantling the Council's ability to sustain conflict, targeting logistics hubs, energy refineries, data archives, and diplomatic relay stations with surgical precision, ensuring that every loss the Council suffered became permanent, while human losses were rapidly replaced. And across Earth and its colonies, production scaled beyond anything the galaxy had witnessed, with modular shipyards assembling combat vessels in weeks rather than years, using standardized components that allowed damaged ships to be repaired or rebuilt faster than Council intelligence could track. And civilians did not panic under this pressure but adapted, learning emergency engineering protocols, resource allocation strategies, and even basic fleet coordination principles through public training broadcasts, turning the entire population into a strategic asset rather than a liability. And as human influence expanded outward, neutral civilizations began offering silent assistance, sharing navigational data, or simply refusing Council resupply requests, not out of allegiance to Earth, but out of fear of becoming the next target of human retaliation. And the Council chambers grew quieter with each passing cycle. Their once grand debates reduced to grim acknowledgments of losses that could no longer be concealed. And when the Council authorized the deployment of their most ancient and revered war constructs, weapons said to have ended empires, humanity responded not with panic, but with analysis, identifying weaknesses, adapting countermeasures, and dismantling legends with the same methodical precision they applied to everything else. And by the end of this phase, it was no longer a question of whether humanity would survive, but whether the Galactic Council itself would endure the consequences of provoking a species that learned faster than it could be defeated. And as the stars beyond the solar system filled with the silent evidence of Council defeat, the galaxy began to understand that humanity was not merely fighting back, it was redefining what dominance meant. And the regret that followed the Council's declaration of war was no longer emotional or political, but existential, because they had awakened a civilization that would never again accept being underestimated, dismissed, or threatened without response. By the time the war entered its fifth phase, the Galactic Council no longer spoke of victory, but of containment, a quiet admission that their original objective of erasing Earth from the galactic equation had failed beyond recovery. And this shift in language alone revealed how deeply humanity had altered the balance of power, because humans had not only survived but had seized the initiative in ways the Council could neither predict nor counter. And as human fleets pushed beyond the outer limits of the solar system, they did so with deliberate restraint, avoiding unnecessary destruction, while systematically dismantling Council infrastructure that supported prolonged warfare. And this restraint confused alien commanders even more than human aggression, because it demonstrated discipline rather than desperation, signaling that humanity was fighting with long-term intent rather than emotional reaction. And General Marcus Hale emphasized this philosophy during every strategic briefing, reminding commanders that fear was a weapon but stability was power. And under his guidance, human forces began executing synchronized pressure campaigns across multiple Council sectors, striking shipyards, fuel nexuses, and data vaults within hours of each other, forcing alien leadership to choose which losses to accept because they could not respond everywhere at once. And Admiral Leona Ruiz refined fleet doctrine further, encouraging captains to treat battle plans as living frameworks rather than fixed orders, empowering them to exploit fleeting advantages that alien command hierarchies were too rigid to recognize. And this philosophy bore fruit when a Council armada attempted a surprise counteroffensive near a binary star system, only to find human vessels already positioned in the gravity shear zones, where rapid orbital shifts allowed smaller ships to outmaneuver larger cruisers and tear them apart piece by piece. And among those captains was Elena Ortiz, who coordinated a distributed assault using autonomous drones programmed to mimic human tactical hesitation, baiting alien targeting systems into predictable firing patterns before launching decisive strikes that crippled the armada without significant human losses. And as the debris field expanded, Council analysts struggled to reconcile their projections with reality, discovering that human production curves, learning rates, and tactical evolution exceeded all known galactic norms, and worse. Still, humans began incorporating alien technology into their own systems at an alarming pace, reverse engineering captured components and integrating them within weeks, effectively shortened the technological gap that the Council had relied upon for dominance. And across Earth's colonies, research hubs operated continuously, sharing breakthroughs in propulsion efficiency, energy distribution, and electronic warfare through open military networks that ensured every unit benefited simultaneously. And this transparency stood in stark contrast to Council's secrecy, which slowed adaptation and amplified internal mistrust. And as the war dragged on, dissent within the Council intensified, with several member species covertly withdrawing support, refusing to commit additional fleets, or quietly sabotaging logistical flows. Not out of loyalty to Earth, but from the realization that continued participation risked annihilation. And sensing this fracture, human diplomats began broadcasting targeted communications across neutral systems, not boasting of victories, but calmly outlining the fact of the conflict, presenting incontrovertible evidence of Council losses, and emphasizing humanity's willingness to coexist rather than dominate, provided it was not threatened again. And this measured messaging resonated deeply because it contrasted sharply with the Council's initial arrogance and secrecy, and while alien populations began questioning their leaders, Council. Hardliners authorized one final escalation, deploying a massive convergence fleet intended to overwhelm human defenses through sheer scale, believing that numbers alone could still decide the outcome. But humanity anticipated this move long before it occurred, having analyzed Council behavior patterns and political pressures. And in response, humans prepared layered responses rather than a single decisive engagement, dispersing fleets, seeding false targets, and activating dormant systems across multiple star lanes, ensuring that the convergence fleet would be forced to divide its strength or risk catastrophic overextension. And as the alien armada advanced, it encountered not a unified human wall, but a shifting battlefield that punished every rigid decision. And with each failed maneuver, the psychological toll on alien commanders deepened, because they were no longer fighting an enemy that could be outgunned or outnumbered, but one that learned, adapted, and evolved faster than fear itself. And by the end of this phase, even the most defiant Council leaders could no longer deny the truth that humanity was shaping the war's tempo, direction, and outcome, not through reckless aggression, but through disciplined mastery of chaos. And the galaxy watched in stunned silence as it became increasingly clear that the Council's declaration of war had not only failed to destroy Earth, but had forged a civilization capable of challenging the very foundations of galactic authority, leaving the question no longer whether humanity would stop, but whether anyone could stop humanity if it chose to continue. As the sixth phase of the conflict unfolded, the galaxy began to feel the consequences of the Council's unraveling authority, because systems that had once relied on protection now found themselves exposed, and humanity, fully aware of this shift, moved carefully to avoid creating a vacuum that would plunge entire regions into chaos, demonstrating a level of strategic maturity that alien observers had never expected from a species so new to interstellar war. And while Council fleets regrouped in shrinking numbers, human intelligence networks expanded exponentially, using a combination of captured alien surveillance platforms and human-developed predictive modeling to map not just fleet movements, but political sentiment across dozens of systems, allowing Earth's leadership to anticipate not only where battles would occur, but where resistance would collapse without a fight. And General Marcus Hale emphasized containment over conquest, directing forces to neutralize threats with minimal collateral damage, reinforcing the growing perception that humanity was not seeking domination, but security through undeniable strength. And this distinction proved devastating to Council morale, because it stripped away the narrative that humans were reckless aggressors and replaced it with the far more frightening image of a calm, calculating power that acted only when necessary. And Admiral Leona Ruiz oversaw the implementation of the adaptive engagement matrix, a distributed command architecture that allowed every human vessel to share sensor data, tactical assessments, and engagement outcomes in real time, effectively turning the entire fleet into a single learning organism that improved with every encounter. And when the Council attempted to deploy asymmetric weapons designed to destabilize planetary biospheres, humans responded with rapid counter-engineering, creating containment fields and neutralization protocols within days, not only protecting Earth and its colonies, but rendering the Council's most feared deterrents obsolete. And this moment marked a psychological breaking point, because for the first time in recorded galactic history, a major power had lost its monopoly on existential weapons, and as news spread, several Council member species publicly withdrew from the alliance, citing survival concerns, further isolating the remaining hardliners. And in one decisive engagement near a pulsar system, a council task force attempted to ambush a human logistics convoy, believing supply ships to be vulnerable, only to discover that the convoy was escorted by modular defense platforms disguised as freighters, which unfolded mid-battle, and unleashed coordinated fire that shattered the attacking fleet in minutes. And Captain Elena Ortiz played a key role in that encounter, coordinating civilian traffic controllers and military units into a seamless defensive net, demonstrating once again that humans blurred the line between civilian and military infrastructure in ways alien doctrine could not comprehend. And as the Council's losses mounted, internal communications leaked, revealing panic, blame shifting, and fragmented command authority, all of which human analysts exploited by feeding selective information back into Council networks, accelerating distrust and paralysis. And on Earth, these developments were met not with triumphalism but with sober preparation, as leaders recognized that power carried responsibility, and systems were put in place to prevent unchecked escalation, including civilian oversight committees and multinational decision councils that ensured no single authority could act impulsively. And this internal restraint became yet another strategic advantage, because it made human actions predictable to allies and terrifyingly consistent to enemies. And as the remaining Council fleets consolidated around their core worlds, humanity halted its advance, not out of weakness but calculation, allowing pressure to build without firing a shot. And this pause proved more destructive than any bombardment, because it forced alien leaders to confront the full extent of their failure without the distraction of constant combat. And when human envoys transmitted a single message across Council space stating that Earth sought permanent deterrence, mutual respect, and an end to existential threats, the galaxy understood that the war had crossed a threshold from survival to redefinition, and the realization settled heavily upon every remaining Council member that they were no longer negotiating from a position of authority, but pleading for terms from a species that had transformed from underestimated newcomer into the most adaptive strategic power the galaxy had ever encountered. In that quiet, suffocating pause between battles, the Council's regret deepened into something far worse than fear, because they now understood that humanity would never forget who had forced it to become this strong, nor would it ever again allow its future to rest in the hands of distant, dismissive powers. The seventh phase of the war was defined not by open battles, but by irreversible shifts in power, as the Galactic Council struggled to reassert relevance, while humanity consolidated control over conditions of peace. And across Council space, the absence of coordinated authority led to rising instability, piracy, and localized conflicts that only underscore how dependent the galaxy had become on centralized power structures that now lay fractured. And humanity, recognizing this fragility, moved decisively yet carefully, deploying stabilization fleets not as conquerors, but as enforcers of order, dismantling rogue forces, reopening trade corridors, and restoring communications networks that had collapsed under Council neglect. And this intervention further eroded the Council's moral standing, because systems once loyal to it now experienced greater security under temporary human oversight than they had under centuries of Council rule. And General Marcus Hale insisted that every operation adhere to strict engagement ethics, reinforcing the message that humanity's strength was disciplined rather than tyrannical. And Admiral Leona Ruiz coordinated multinational task groups composed of human vessels and defected alien crews, integrating diverse technologies and command philosophies into a unified operational framework that demonstrated humanity's unmatched ability to synthesize complexity into function. And during this period, Captain Elena Ortiz was tasked with leading a deep reconnaissance mission into Council core territory, not to strike, but to observe. And what her fleet found was not a poised superpower, but a civilization paralyzed by indecision, with fleets held in reserve out of fear of provoking retaliation, and worlds rationing resources as political factions blamed each other for catastrophe. And these findings were transmitted back to Earth, where civilian and military leaders alike understood that the war's final outcome would be determined not by firepower but by narrative control. And so humanity broadcast unfiltered data across open galactic channels, showing the Council's failures, humanity's restraint, and the measurable decline in violence wherever human forces intervened. And this transparency shattered centuries of Council myth-making, causing entire populations to demand withdrawal, reform, or surrender. And when the Council attempted to counter this information campaign with threats and historical precedent, It failed utterly because humanity's evidence was empirical, consistent, and impossible to refute. And even among the remaining hardliners, doubt took root as they realized that continued resistance no longer served survival but pride. And as pressure mounted, humans began formal preparations for a post-war order, drafting frameworks for shared security zones, neutral arbitration systems, and technological exchange agreements designed to prevent any single power from repeating the Council's mistakes. And these preparations were not hidden but openly discussed, reinforcing perception that humanity was planning for stability rather than domination, and this openness accelerated defections, as several Council member worlds formally severed ties and requested protective treaties with Earth, knowing that refusal would isolate them further, and as the Council's authority continued to erode. Its remaining fleets withdrew to defensive perimeters around core worlds, unwilling to risk confrontation yet, unable to concede defeat, trapped between fear of humanity's retaliation and fear of their own population's unrest. And in that narrowing space, regret transformed into desperation, because the Council finally understood that the war had already been lost long before this phase began, the moment they dismissed humanity as insignificant. And as human fleets maintained their silent presence at the edges of Council territory, neither advancing nor retreating, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the final resolution, knowing that the next move would not merely end a war, but redefine the structure of interstellar civilization itself. And in that stillness, the Council's greatest realization took hold, that humanity had not needed to destroy them to win, because by exposing their weakness, replacing their authority, and offering a better alternative, humans had achieved something far more permanent than conquest, leaving the Council isolated, irrelevant, and facing a future shaped entirely by the species they had once believed too small to matter. The final resolution came not with a final battle, but with an undeniable acknowledgement of reality, as the Galactic Council convened its last emergency session under conditions that would have been unthinkable at the start of the war, surrounded not by confidence or authority, but by silence, fear, and the knowledge that every option available to them had already been outpaced by humanity's foresight. And when the Council transmitted its formal cessation directive across open channels, it was devoid of the arrogance that had defined its earlier proclamations, instead carrying a tone of reluctant acceptance that marked the end of its dominance, and Earth's response was measured and immediate, with General Marcus Hale authorizing the standing down of forward strike groups while maintaining deterrence positions, signaling that humanity sought closure rather than humiliation. And Admiral Leona Ruiz oversaw the transition of military operations into stabilization frameworks, ensuring that systems destabilized by the Council's collapse did not descend into chaos. And as Captain Elena Ortiz returned from her final patrol, her reports confirmed what Earth's analysts had already concluded, that no organized resistance remained, only fractured remnants clinging to outdated authority structures. And across the galaxy, the effects of the war settled in waves. As former Council member worlds renegotiated their alliances, adopted new security doctrines, and quietly acknowledged that the age of unquestioned centralized power had ended, replaced by a balance shaped by accountability, transparency, and the ever-present awareness of human capability. And humanity did not proclaim itself ruler or savior, instead formalizing a doctrine of mutual deterrence and shared defense that made one truth unmistakable: that any future attempt at existential coercion would be met with immediate and overwhelming response. And this doctrine was not enforced through fear alone, but through visible consistency. As human fleets withdrew from non-essential positions, honored every ceasefire clause, and upheld every agreement without exception, creating a level of trust the Council had never achieved in its long history. And historians across the galaxy would later mark this moment as the true end of the war, not because the last weapon had been fired, but because the final illusion had collapsed, the illusion that humanity was weak, predictable, or disposable, and on Earth, the population returned to rebuilding and exploration with quiet pride rather than celebration, understanding that survival had come at the cost of innocence, but it also forged unity, resilience, and clarity of purpose, and children would grow up learning not tales of conquest, but lessons of preparation, adaptability, and restraint, taught as reminders of what had been necessary to ensure humanity would never again face annihilation without recourse. And as interstellar relations stabilized under the new order, the phrase that spread across countless worlds was not one of fear, but of caution. A simple acknowledgement passed from diplomat to commander, from trader to governor, that Earth was no longer a minor world to be dismissed, because the species that lived there had demonstrated a singular truth the galaxy would never forget, that when humanity was threatened with extinction, it did not collapse. It adapted, it learned, and became something unstoppable, and so the Galactic Council's declaration of war passed into history as the moment everything changed, not because it nearly destroyed Earth, but because it revealed that humanity, once provoked, would ensure that such a mistake could never be made again, and in that lasting realization, the galaxy found both its warning and its balance, shaped forever by the day it declared war on Earth and instantly regretted it.